question, man and consciousness come into the matter, and with them the possibility of meaning. The chance-created picture may be beautiful or ugly, harmonious or discordant, rich or poor in content, well or ill painted. These factors determine its artistic value, but they cannot satisfy the psychologist, often to the distress of the artist or of anyone who finds supreme satisfaction in the contemplation of form. The psychologist seeks further and tries to understand the secret code of chance arrangement, insofar as man can decipher it at all. The number and form of the objects thrown together at random by Arp raise as many questions as any detail of Ernst's fantastic frottage. For the psychologist, they are symbols, and therefore they can not only be felt, but, up to a certain point, can also be interpreted. The apparent or actual retreat of man from many modern works of art, the lack of reflection, and the predominance of the unconscious over consciousness offers critics frequent points of attack. They speak of pathological art, or compare it with pictures by the insane, for it is characteristic of psychosis that consciousness and the ego personality are submerged and drowned by floods of contents from the unconscious regions of the psyche. It is true that the comparison is not so odious today as it was even a generation ago. When Dr. Jung first pointed out a connection of this kind in his essay on Picasso, 1932, it provoked a storm of indignation. Today, the catalogue of a well-known Zurich art gallery speaks of the almost schizophrenic obsession of a famous artist, and the German writer Rudolf Kastner described Georg Trakl as one of the greatest German poets, continuing, "There was something schizophrenic about him. It can be felt in his work. There is a touch of schizophrenia in it, too. Yes, Trakl is a great poet." It is now realized that a state of schizophrenia and the artistic vision are not mutually exclusive. To my mind, the famous experiments with mescaline and similar drugs have contributed to this change of attitude. These drugs create a condition accompanied by intense visions of colors and forms, not unlike schizophrenia. More than one artist of today has sought inspiration in such a drug. The retreat from reality. Franz Marc once said, "The art that is coming will give formal expression to our scientific conviction." This was a truly prophetic saying. We have traced the influence on artists of Freud's psychoanalysis and of the discovery or rediscovery of the unconscious in the early years of the 20th century. Another important point is the connection between modern art and the results of research in nuclear physics. To put it in simple, non-scientific terms, nuclear physics has robbed the basic units of matter of their absolute concreteness. It has made matter mysterious. Paradoxically, mass and energy, wave and particle, have proved to be interchangeable. The laws of cause and effect have become valid only up to a certain point. It does not matter at all that these relativities, discontinuities, and paradoxes hold good only on the margins of our world, only for the infinitely small, the atom, and the infinitely great, the cosmos. They have caused a revolutionary change in the concept of reality, for a new, totally different, and irrational reality has dawned behind the reality of our natural world, which is ruled by the laws of classical physics. Corresponding relativities and paradoxes were discovered in the domain of the psyche. Here, too, another world dawned on the margin of the world of consciousness, governed by new and hitherto unknown laws that are strangely akin to the laws of nuclear physics. The parallelism between nuclear physics and the psychology of the collective unconscious was often a subject of discussion between Jung and Wolfgang Pauli, the Nobel Prize winner in physics. The space-time continuum of physics and the collective unconscious can be seen, so to speak, as the outer and inner aspects of one and the same reality behind appearances. The relationship between physics and psychology will be discussed by Dr. M. L. von Franz in her concluding essay. It is characteristic of this one world behind the worlds of physics and the psyche that its laws, processes, and contents are unimaginable. That is a fact of outstanding importance for the understanding of the art of our time. For the main subject of modern art is, in a certain sense, unimaginable too. Therefore, much modern art has become abstract. The great artists of this century have sought to give visible form to the life behind things, and so their works are a symbolic expression of a world behind consciousness, or indeed behind dreams, for dreams are only rarely non-figurative. Thus they point to the one reality, the one life, which seems to be the common background of the two domains of physical and psychic appearances. Only a few artists realized the connection between their form of expression and physics and psychology. Kandinsky is one of the masters who expressed the deep emotion he felt at the early discoveries of modern physical research. In my mind, the collapse of the atom was the collapse of the whole world. Suddenly the stoutest walls fell. Everything turned unstable, insecure, and soft. I would not have been surprised if a stone had melted into thin air before my eyes. Science seemed to have been annihilated. What resulted from this disillusion was the artist's withdrawal from the realm of nature, from the populous foreground of things. It seemed, Kandinsky added, as if I saw art steadily disengaging itself from nature. This separation from the world of things happened more or less at the same time to other artists, too. Franz Marc wrote, "Have we not learned from 1,000 years of experience that things cease to speak the more we hold them up to the visual mirror of their appearance? Appearance is eternally flat." For Marc, the goal of art was to reveal unearthly life dwelling behind everything, to break the mirror of life so that we may look being in the face. Paul Klee wrote, "The artist does not ascribe to the natural form of appearance the same convincing significance as the realists who are his critics. He does not feel so intimately bound to that reality because he cannot see in the formal products of nature the essence of the creative process. He is more concerned with formative powers than with formal products." Piet Mondrian accused Cubism of not having pursued abstraction to its logical end, the expression of pure reality. That can only be attained by the creation of pure form, unconditioned by subjective feelings and ideas. Behind changing natural forms, there lies changeless pure reality. A great number of artists were seeking to get past appearances into the reality of the background, or the spirit in matter, by a transmutation of things, through fantasy, surrealism, dream pictures, the use of chance, etc. The abstract artists, however, turned their backs on things. Their paintings contained no identifiable concrete objects. They were, in Mondrian's words, simply pure form. But it must be realized that what these artists were concerned with was something far greater than a problem of form and the distinction between concrete and abstract, figurative and non-figurative. Their goal was the center of life and things, their changeless background, and an inward certitude. Art had become mysticism. The spirit in whose mystery art was submerged was an earthly spirit, which the medieval alchemists had called Mercurius. He is a symbol of the spirit that these artists divined or sought behind nature and things, behind the appearance of nature. Their mysticism was alien to Christianity, for that mercurial spirit is alien to a heavenly spirit. Indeed, it was Christianity's dark adversary that was forging its way in art. Here we begin to see the real historical and symbolic significance of modern art. Like the Hermetic movements in the Middle Ages, it must be understood as a mysticism of the spirit of earth, and therefore as an expression of our time compensatory to Christianity. No artist sensed this mystic background of art more clearly, or spoke of it with greater passion, than Kandinsky. The importance of the great works of art of all time did not lie, in his eyes, on the surface, in externals, but in the root of all roots, in the mystical content of art. Therefore, he says, the artist's eye should always be turned in upon his inner life, and his ear should be always alert for the voice of inward necessity. This is the only way of giving expression to what the mystic vision commands. Kandinsky called his pictures a spiritual expression of the cosmos, a music of the spheres, a harmony of colors and forms. Form, even if it is quite abstract and geometrical, has an inward clang. It is a spiritual being with effects that coincide absolutely with that form. The impact of the acute angle of a triangle on a circle is actually as overwhelming in effect as the finger of God touching the finger of Adam in Michelangelo. In 1914, Franz Marc wrote in his aphorisms, "Matter is a thing that man can at best tolerate. He refuses to recognize it. The contemplation of the world has become the penetration of the world. There is no mystic who, in his moments of sublimest rapture, ever attained the perfect abstraction of modern thought, or took his soundings with a deeper plummet." Paul Klee, who may be regarded as the poet among modern painters, says, "It is the artist's mission to penetrate, as far as may be, toward that secret ground where primal law feeds growth. Which artist would not wish to dwell at the central organ of all motion in space-time, be it the brain or the heart of creation, from which all functions derive their life? In the womb of nature, in the primal ground of creation, where the secret key to all things lies hidden. Our beating heart drives us downward, far down to the primal ground. What is encountered on this journey must be taken most seriously when it is perfectly fused with the appropriate artistic means in visible form, because, as Klee adds, it is not a question of merely reproducing what is seen. The secretly perceived is made visible. Klee's work is rooted in that primal ground. My hand is entirely the instrument of a more distant sphere, nor is it my head that functions in my work. It is something else. In his work, the spirit of nature and the spirit of the unconscious became inseparable. They have drawn him and draw us, the onlookers, into their magic circle. Klee's work is the most complex expression, now poetic, now demonic, of the chthonic spirit. Humor and bizarre ideas build a bridge from the realm of the dark underworld to the human world. The bond between his fantasy and the earth is the careful observation of the laws of nature and the love for all creatures. For the artist, he once wrote, the dialogue with nature is the conditio sine qua non of his work. A different expression of the hidden unconscious spirit can be found in one of the most notable of the younger abstract painters, Jackson Pollock, an American who was killed in a car accident when he was 44. His work has had a great influence on the younger artists of our time. In My Painting, he revealed that he painted in a kind of trance. When I am in my painting, I am not aware of what I am doing. It is only after a sort of get-acquainted period that I see what I have been about. I have no fears about making changes, destroying the image, etc., because the painting has a life of its own. I try to let it come through. It is only when I lose contact with the painting that the result is a mess. Otherwise, there is pure harmony, an easy give and take, and the painting comes out well. Pollock's pictures, which were painted practically unconsciously, are charged with boundless emotional vehemence. In their lack of structure, they are almost chaotic, a glowing lava stream of colors, lines, planes, and points. They may be regarded as a parallel to what the alchemists called the massa confusa, the prima materia, or chaos, all ways of defining the precious prime matter of the alchemical process, the starting point of the quest for the essence of being. Pollock's pictures represent the nothing that is everything, that is, the unconscious itself. They seem to live in a time before the emergence of consciousness and being, or to be fantastic landscapes of a time after the extinction of consciousness and being. In the middle of our century, the purely abstract picture, without any regular order of forms and colors, has become the most frequent expression in painting. The deeper the dissolution of reality, the more the picture loses its symbolic content. The reason for this lies in the nature of the symbol and its function. The symbol is an object of the known world, hinting at something unknown. It is the known expressing the life and sense of the inexpressible. But in merely abstract paintings, the world of the known has completely vanished. Nothing is left to form a bridge to the unknown. On the other hand, these paintings reveal an unexpected background, a hidden sense. They often turn out to be more or less exact images of nature itself, showing an astounding similarity with the molecular structure of organic and inorganic elements of nature. This is a perplexing fact. Pure abstraction has become an image of concrete nature, but Jung may give us the key to understanding. The deeper layers of the psyche, he has said, lose their individual uniqueness as they retreat farther and farther into darkness. Lower down, that is to say, as they approach the autonomous functional systems, they become increasingly collective until they are universalized and extinguished in the body's materiality, that is, in chemical substances. The body's carbon is simply carbon. Hence, at bottom, the psyche is simply world. A comparison of abstract paintings and microphotographs shows that utter abstraction of imaginative art has, in a secret and surprising way, become naturalistic, its subject being elements of matter. The great abstraction and the great realism, which parted at the beginning of our century, have come together again. We remember Kandinsky's words, "The poles open two paths, which both lead to one goal at the end." This goal, the point of union, is reached in modern abstract paintings, but it is attained completely unconsciously. The artist's intention plays no part in the process. This point leads to a most important fact about modern art. The artist is, as it were, not so free in his creative work as he may think he is. If his work is performed in a more or less unconscious way, it is controlled by laws of nature that on the deepest level correspond to the laws of the psyche, and vice versa. The great pioneers of modern art gave clearest expression to its true aims and to the depths from which the spirit rose that left its imprint on them. This point is important, though later artists who may have failed to realize it did not always plumb the same depths. Yet neither Kandinsky nor Klee nor any other of the early masters of modern painting was ever aware of the grave psychological danger he was undergoing with the mystical submersion in the chthonic spirit and the primal ground of nature. That danger must now be explained. As a starting point, we may take another aspect of abstract art. The German writer Wilhelm Wöhringer interpreted abstract art as the expression of a metaphysical unease and anxiety that seemed to him to be more pronounced among northern peoples. As he explained, they suffer from reality. The naturalness of the southern peoples is denied to them, and they long for a super-real and super-sensual world to which they give expression in imaginative or abstract art. But as Sir Herbert Reed remarks in his concise history of modern art, metaphysical anxiety is no longer only Germanic and northern, it now characterizes the whole of the modern world. Reed quotes Klee, who wrote in his diary at the beginning of 1915, "The more horrifying this world becomes, as it is in these days, the more art becomes abstract, while a world at peace produces realistic art." To Franz Marc, abstraction offered a refuge from the evil and ugliness in this world. Very early in life I felt that man was ugly. The animals seemed to be more lovely and pure. Even among them I discovered so much that was revolting and hideous that my painting became more and more schematic and abstract. A good deal may be learned from a conversation that took place in 1958 between the Italian sculptor Marino Marini and the writer Edward Roditi. The dominant subject that Marini treated for years in many variations is the nude figure of a youth on a horse. In the early versions, which he described in the conversation as symbols of hope and gratitude after the end of the Second World War, the rider sits his horse with outstretched arms, his body bending slightly backward. In the course of years, the treatment of the subject became more abstract. The more or less classical form of the rider gradually dissolved. Speaking of the feeling underlying this change, Marini said, "If you look at my equestrian statues of the last 12 years in order of time, you will notice that the animal's panic steadily increases, but that it is frozen with terror and stands paralyzed rather than rearing or taking flight. That is all because I believe that we are approaching the end of the world. In every figure, I strove to express a deepening fear and despair. In this way, I am attempting to symbolize the last stage of a dying myth, the myth of the individual, victorious hero, of the humanist's man of virtue. In fairy tale and myth, the victorious hero is a symbol of consciousness. His defeat, as Marini says himself, means the death of the individual, a phenomenon that appears in a social context as the submergence of the individual in the mass, and in art as the decline of the human element. When Roditi asked whether Marini's style was abandoning the classical canon on its way to becoming abstract, Marini replied, As soon as art has to express fear, it must of itself depart from the classical ideal. He found subjects for his work in the bodies excavated at Pompeii. Roditi called Marini's art a Hiroshima style, for it conjures up visions of the end of a world. Marini admitted it. He felt, he said, as if he had been expelled from an earthly paradise. Until recently, the sculptor aimed at full sensual and powerful forms. But for the last 15 years, sculpture prefers forms in disintegration. The conversation between Marini and Roditi explains the transformation of sensory art into abstraction that should be clear to anyone who has ever walked open-eyed through an exhibition of modern art. However much he may appreciate or admire its formal qualities, he can scarcely fail to sense the fear, despair, aggression, and mockery that sounds like a cry from many works. The metaphysical anxiety that is expressed by the distress in these pictures and sculptures may have arisen from the despair of a doomed world, as it did with Marini. In other cases, the emphasis may lie on the religious factor, on the feeling that God is dead. There is a close connection between the two. At the root of this inner distress lies the defeat, or rather the retreat of consciousness. In the upsurge of mystical experience, everything that once bound man to the human world, to earth, to time and space, to matter and the natural living of life, has been cast aside or dissolved. But unless the unconscious is balanced by the experience of consciousness, it will implacably reveal its contrary or negative aspect. The wealth of creative sound that made the harmony of the spheres, or the wonderful mysteries of the primal ground, have yielded to destruction and despair. In more than one case, the artist has become the passive victim of the unconscious. In physics, too, the world of the background has revealed its paradoxical nature. The laws of the inmost elements of nature, the newly discovered structures and relations in its basic unit, the atom, have become the scientific foundation for unprecedented weapons of destruction and opened the way to annihilation. Ultimate knowledge and the destruction of the world are the two aspects of the discovery of the primal ground of nature. Jung, who was as familiar with the dangerous dual nature of the unconscious as with the importance of human consciousness, could offer mankind only one weapon against catastrophe, the call for individual consciousness, which seems so simple and yet is so arduous. Consciousness is not only indispensable as a counterpoise to the unconscious, and not only gives the possibility of meaning to life, it is also an eminently practical function. The evil witnessed in the world outside, in neighbors or neighboring peoples, can be made conscious as evil contents of our own psyche as well, and this insight would be the first step to a radical change in our attitude to our neighbors. Envy, lust, sensuality, lies, and all known vices are the negative, dark aspect of the unconscious, which can manifest itself in two ways. In the positive sense, it appears as a spirit of nature, creatively animating man, things, and the world. It is the chthonic spirit that has been mentioned so often in this chapter. In the negative sense, the unconscious, that same spirit, manifests itself as a spirit of evil, as a drive to destroy. As has already been pointed out, the alchemists personified this spirit as the spirit Mercurius, and called it with good reason Mercurius duplex, the two-faced dual Mercurius. In the religious language of Christianity, it is called the devil. But however improbable it may seem, the devil, too, has a dual aspect. In the positive sense, he appears as Lucifer, literally the light-bringer. Looked at in the light of these difficult and paradoxical ideas, modern art, which we have recognized as symbolic of the chthonic spirit, also has a dual aspect. In the positive sense, it is the expression of a mysteriously profound nature mysticism. In the negative, it can only be interpreted as the expression of an evil or destructive spirit. The two sides belong together, for the paradox is one of the basic qualities of the unconscious and its contents. To prevent any misunderstanding, it must once more be emphasized that these considerations have nothing to do with artistic and aesthetic values, but are solely concerned with the interpretation of modern art as a symbol of our time. Union of opposites. There is one more point to be made. The spirit of the age is in constant movement. It is like a river that flows on, invisibly but surely, and given the momentum of life in our century, even 10 years is a long time. About the middle of this century, a change began to come over painting. It was nothing revolutionary, nothing like the change that happened about 1910, which meant the reconstruction of art to its very foundations. But there were groups of artists who formulated their aims in ways not heard before. This transformation is going on within the frontiers of abstract painting. The representation of concrete reality, which springs from the primal human need of catching the passing moment on the wing, has become a truly concrete, sensuous art in the photography of such men as Francis-Henri Cartier-Bresson, Switzerland's Werner Bischoff, and others. We can therefore understand why artists continued on their own way of inwardness and imagination. For a good many of the young artists, however, abstract art as it had been practiced for many years offered no adventure, no field of conquest. Seeking the new, they found it in what lay nearest, yet had been lost, in nature and man. They were not and are not concerned with the reproduction of nature in pictures, but with the expression of their own emotional experience of nature. The French painter Alfred Manessier defined the aims of his art in these words: "What we have to reconquer is the weight of lost reality. We must make for ourselves a new heart, a new spirit, a new soul in the measure of man. The painter's true reality lies neither in abstraction nor in realism, but in the reconquest of his weight as a human being. At present, non-figurative art seems to me to offer the one opportunity for the painter to approach the inward reality of himself and to grasp the consciousness of his essential self, or even of his being. It is only by the reconquest of his position, I believe, that the painter will be able, in the time to come, to return slowly to himself, to rediscover his own weight, and so to strengthen it, that it can even reach the outward reality of the world." Jean Bazaine speaks in similar terms. It is a great temptation for the painter of today to paint the pure rhythm of his feeling, the most secret pulse of his heart, instead of embodying it in a concrete form. That, however, leads only to a desiccated mathematics, or a kind of abstract expressionism, which ends in monotony and a progressive impoverishment of form. But a form that can reconcile man with his world is an art of communion by which man, at any moment, can recognize his own unformed countenance in the world. What, in fact, artists now have at heart is a conscious reunion of their own inward reality with the reality of the world or of nature, or, in the last resort, a new union of body and soul, matter and spirit. That is their way to the reconquest of their weight as human beings. Only now is the great rift that set in with modern art between great abstraction and great realism being made conscious and on the way to being healed. For the onlooker, this first becomes evident in the changed atmosphere in the works of these artists. There radiates from the pictures of such artists as Alfred Manessier or the Belgian-born painter Gustav Jung, in spite of all abstraction, a belief in the world, and in spite of all intensity of feeling, a harmony of forms and colors that often attains serenity. In the French painter Jean Lussat's famous tapestries of the 1950s, the exuberance of nature pervades the picture. His art could be called sensuous as well as imaginative. We find a serene harmony of forms and colors also in the work of Paul Klee. This harmony was what he had always been striving for. Above all, he had realized the necessity of not denying evil. Even evil must not be a triumphant or degrading enemy, but a power collaborating in the whole. But Klee's starting point was not the same. He lived near the dead and the unborn, at an almost cosmic distance from this world, while the younger generation of painters can be said to be more firmly rooted in earth. An important point to notice is that modern painting, just when it has advanced far enough to discern the union of the opposites, has taken up religious themes. The metaphysical void seems to have been overcome, and the utterly unexpected has happened. The Church has become a patron of modern art. We need only mention here All Saints at Basel, with windows by Alfred Manessier, Assy Church, with pictures by a large number of modern artists, the Matisse Chapel at Vence, and the church at Audincourt, which has works by Jean Bazaine and the French artist Fernand Léger. The admission of modern art to the Church means more than an act of broad-mindedness on the part of its patrons. It is symbolic of the fact that the part played by modern art in relation to Christianity is changing. The compensatory function of the old Hermetic movement has made way for the possibility of collaboration. In discussing the animal symbols of Christ, it was pointed out that the light and the chthonic spirits belonged to each other. It seems as if the moment had come today when a new stage in the solution of this millennial problem might be reached. What the future will yield we cannot know, whether the bridging of the opposites will give positive results, or whether the way will lead through yet more unimaginable catastrophes. There is too much anxiety and too much dread at work in the world, and this is still the predominant factor in art and society. Above all, there is still too much unwillingness on the part of the individual to apply to himself and his life the conclusions that can be drawn from art, although he might be ready to accept them in art. The artist can often express many things unconsciously and without awakening hostility, which are resented when they are expressed by a psychologist, a fact that could be demonstrated even more conclusively in literature than in the visual arts. Confronted by the statements of the psychologist, the individual feels directly challenged, but what the artist has to say, particularly in our century, usually remains in an impersonal sphere. And yet it seems important that the suggestion of a more whole and therefore a more human form of expression should have become visible in our time. It is a glimmer of hope, symbolized for me, at the time of writing, 1961, by a number of paintings by the French artist Pierre Soulages. Behind a cataract of huge black rafters, there glimmers a clear, pure blue or a radiant yellow. Light is dawning behind darkness. End of Side 8. Change side selector switch. This book is continued on the next cassette. Side 9. Man and His Symbols by Carl G. Jung. Continuing with Symbolism in the Visual Arts on page 271. Photo captions. Variation Within a Sphere, number 10. The Sun, by Richard Lippold. Above left, the stone alignments at Karnak in Brittany, dating from about 2000 B.C. Crude stones set upright in rows that are thought to have been used in sacred rituals and religious processions. Left, rough stones resting on raked sand in a Zen Buddhist rock garden in the Ryoanji Temple, Japan. Though apparently haphazard, the stone's arrangement in fact expresses a highly refined spirituality. Right, a prehistoric menhir, a rock that has been slightly carved into a female form, probably a mother goddess. Far right, a sculpture by Max Ernst, born 1891, has also hardly altered the natural shape of the stone. Far left, animal paintings on cave walls at Lascaux. The paintings were not simply decorative, they had a magical function. Left, a drawing of a bison covered with arrow and spear marks. The cave dwellers believed that by ritually killing the image, they would be more likely to kill the animal. Even today, the destruction of an effigy or statue is a symbolic killing of the person depicted. Right, a statue of Stalin destroyed by Hungarian rebels in 1956. Far right, rebels hang a bust of the former Stalinist Hungarian premier Matyas Rákosi. Far left, a prehistoric painting from Trois Frères Cave includes, lower right corner, a human figure, perhaps a shaman, with horns and hoofs. As examples of animal dances, left, a Burmese buffalo dance in which masked dancers are possessed by the buffalo spirit. Right, a Bolivian devil dance in which the dancers wear demonic animal masks. Far right, an old southwest German folk dance in which the dancers are disguised as witches and as animal-like wild men. Left, a mask used in the ancient No drama of Japan, in which the players often portray gods, spirits, or demons. Above right, masked performers in Japanese dance theater. Below right, an actor in Japan's kabuki drama dressed as a medieval hero with mask-like makeup. Examples of animal symbols of divinities from 3 religions. Top of page, the Hindu god Ganesha, a painted sculpture from the royal palace of Nepal, god of prudence and wisdom. Above, the Greek god Zeus in the form of a swan with Leda. Right, on opposite sides of a medieval coin, the crucified Christ shown as a man and as a serpent. Right, a yantra, a form of mandala, composed of 9 linked triangles. The mandala, symbolizing wholeness, is often connected with exceptional beings of myth or legend. Far right, a Tibetan painting of the birth of Buddha. In the lower left corner, Buddha takes his first steps on a cross formed of circular blossoms. Above right, the birth of Alexander the Great, a 16th century manuscript illustration heralded by comets in circular or mandala form. Left, an example of the mandala in religious architecture, the Angkor Wat Buddhist temple in Cambodia, a square building with entrances at the 4 corners. Right, the ruins of a fortified camp in Denmark, about AD 1000, which was laid out in a circle, as is the fortress town, center right, of Palmanova, Italy, built in 1593, with its star-shaped fortifications. Far right, the streets that meet at L'Étoile, Paris, to form a mandala. Medieval religious architecture was usually based on the shape of the cross. Left, a 13th century church in Ethiopia cut from the rock. Renaissance religious art shows a reorientation to the earth and the body. Right, a plan for a circular church or basilica based on the body's proportions, drawn by the 15th century Italian artist and architect Francesco di Giorgio. The Renaissance interest in outer reality produced the Copernican sun-centered universe, left, and turned artists away from imaginative art to nature. Below left, Leonardo's study of the human heart. Renaissance art, with its sensuous concern with light, nature, and the body, far left, a Tintoretto, 16th century, set a pattern that lasted until the Impressionists. Below, a painting by Renoir, 1841 to 1919. Far left, the symbolic alchemical concept of the squared circle, symbol of wholeness and of the union of opposites. Note the male and female figures. Left, a modern squared circle by the British artist Ben Nicholson, born 1894. It is a strictly geometrical, empty form possessing aesthetic harmony and beauty, but without symbolic meaning. Right, a sunwheel, in a painting by the modern Japanese artist Sofu Teshigahara, born 1900, follows the tendency of many modern painters, when using circular shapes, to make them asymmetrical. Left, Limits of Understanding, by Paul Klee, 1879 to 1940. One 20th century painting in which the symbol of the circle retains a dominant position. Circles appear broken or loosely scattered in The Sun and the Moon, top, by Robert Delaunay, 1885 to 1941, in A Few Circles, left, by Kandinsky, 1866 to 1944, and in Landscape from a Dream, right, by Paul Nash, 1889 to 1946. Below, Composition, by Piet Mondrian, 1872 to 1944, is dominated by squares. Above, an illustration from a 16th century German broadsheet of some strange circular objects seen in the sky, similar to the flying saucers that have been seen in recent years. Jung has suggested that such visions are projections of the archetype of wholeness. Sensory or representational art versus imaginative or unrealistic art. Right, a painting by the 19th century British artist William Frith, part of a sequence depicting a gambler's downfall. This is one extreme of representational art. It has declined into mannerism and sentiment. Left, an extreme of imaginative and here abstract art by Kazimir Malevich, 1878 to 1935. Suprematist composition, White on White, 1918. Collection, the Museum of Modern Art, New York. Left and above, two compositions by Kurt Schwitters, 1887 to 1948. His kind of imaginative art uses and transforms ordinary things, in this case, old tickets, paper, metal, etc. Below left, pieces of wood similarly used by Hans Arp, 1887 to 1966. Below, in a sculpture by Picasso, 1881 to 1973, ordinary objects, leaves, are part of the subject rather than the material. An example of surrealist art, Les Souliers Rouges by the French painter René Magritte, 1898 to 1967. Much of the disturbing effect of surrealist painting comes from its association and juxtaposition of unrelated objects, often absurd, irrational, and dreamlike. Both Giorgio de Chirico, born 1888, and Marc Chagall, born 1887, have sought to look behind the outward appearances of things. Their work seems to have risen from the depths of the unconscious, but Chirico's vision, below, his philosopher and poet, was gloomy, melancholy, even nightmarish. Chagall's has always been rich, warm, and alive. Right, one of his great stained glass windows, created in 1962 for a Jerusalem synagogue. In Chirico's Song of Love, left, the marble head of the goddess and the rubber glove are crass opposites. The green ball seems to act as a uniting symbol. Right, Metaphysical Muse by Carlo Carrà, 1881 to 1966. The faceless mannequin was a frequent theme of Chirico's as well. One of the best known of modern surrealist painters is Salvador Dali, born 1904. Above, his famous painting, The Burning Giraffe. Below, one of Max Ernst's frottage, usually rubbings taken from scratches on tiles, from his Natural History. Ernst's Natural History resembles the interest taken in the past in accidental patterns in nature. Below, an engraving of an 18th century Dutch museum exhibit that is also a kind of surrealist natural history, with its inclusion of coral, stones, and skeletons. Right. Roman coins used in places progressively farther away from Rome. On the last coin, farthest from the controlling center, the face has disintegrated. This strangely corresponds to the psychic disintegration that such drugs as LSD-25 can induce. Below, drawings done by an artist who took this drug in a test held in Germany in 1951. The drawings grow more abstract as conscious control is overcome by the unconscious. The paintings on these pages, all by Franz Marc, 1880 to 1916, show his gradual development away from a concern with outward things toward a more completely abstract art. Far left, Blue Horses, 1911. Center, Rose in a Wood, 1913-1914. Below, Play of Forms, 1914. Left, Piet Mondrian's Painting No. 1, an example of the modern approach to pure form, Mondrian's term, through the use of wholly abstract geometrical shapes. Painting No. 1, 1926. Collection, the Museum of Modern Art, New York. The art of Paul Klee is a visual exploration and expression of the spirit in and behind nature, the unconscious, or as he termed it, the secretly perceived. Sometimes his vision can be disturbing and demonic, as in his Death and Fire, right, or it can be a more poetic kind of fantasy, as in his Sinbad the Sailor, far right. The paintings of Jackson Pollock, left, his No. 23, were painted in a trance, unconsciously, as are the works of other modern artists, such as the French action painter Georges Mathieu, far left. The chaotic but powerful result may be compared to the massa confusa of alchemy, and strangely resembles the hitherto hidden forms of matter as revealed in microphotographs. See Part 1, Approaching the Unconscious. Right, a similar configuration, a vibration pattern made by sound waves in glycerin. Top left and center, 2 sculptures by Marino Marini, 1901 to 1966, from 1945 and 1951, respectively, show how the theme of horse and rider was altered from an expression of tranquility to one of tortured fear and despair, while the sculptures themselves grew correspondingly more and more abstract. Marini's later work was influenced by the equally panic-stricken shapes of bodies found at Pompeii, left. In this century, the depiction of actuality, once the province of the painter and sculptor, has been taken over by the photographer, whose camera can not only record, but, like any landscape painting of past centuries, can express the photographer's own emotional experience of the subject. Right, a Japanese scene photographed by Werner Bischoff, 1916 to 1954. Mid-20th century art seems to be moving away from a Marini-like despair, as is seen in the gesture of Jean Lersat, who exhibited his work in a field, top left, a link with nature and the earth. Above, Dédicace à Sainte Marie-Madeleine by Alfred Manessier, born 1911. Top right, Pour la naissance du surhomme by Francis Pierre-Yves Trémois, born 1921. Both works indicate a tendency toward life and wholeness. The painting right by Pierre Soulages, born 1919, might be understood as a symbol of hope. Behind the cataclysmic darkness can be seen a glimmer of light. End of photo captions. Part 5. Symbols in an Individual Analysis by Yolanda Jacobi. The beginning of the analysis. There is a widespread belief that the methods of Jungian psychology are applicable only to middle-aged people. True, many men and women reach middle age without achieving psychological maturity, and it is therefore necessary to help them through the neglected phases of their development. They have not completed the first part of the process of individuation that Dr. M.L. von Franz has described. But it is also true that a young person can encounter serious problems as he grows up. If a young person is afraid of life and finds it hard to adjust to reality, he might prefer to dwell in his fantasies or to remain a child. In such a young person, especially if he is introverted, one can sometimes discover unexpected treasures in the unconscious, and by bringing them into consciousness, strengthen his ego and give him the psychic energy he needs to grow into a mature person. That is the function of the powerful symbolism of our dreams. Other contributors to this book have described the nature of these symbols and the role they play in man's psychological nature. I wish to show how analysis can aid the individuation process by taking the example of a young engineer, aged 25, whom I shall call Henry. Henry came from a rural district in eastern Switzerland. His father, of Protestant peasant stock, was a general practitioner. Henry described him as a man with high moral standards, but a rather withdrawn person who found it difficult to relate to other people. He was more of a father to his patients than to his children. At home, Henry's mother was the dominant personality. "We were raised by the strong hand of our mother," he said on one occasion. She came from a family with an academic background and wide artistic interests. She herself, in spite of her strictness, had a broad spiritual horizon. She was impulsive and romantic. She had a great love for Italy. Though she was by birth a Catholic, her children had been brought up in the Protestantism of their father. Henry had a sister, older than himself, with whom he had a good relationship. Henry was introverted, shy, finely drawn, and very tall, with light hair, a high pale forehead, and blue eyes with dark shadows. He did not think that neurosis, the most usual reason, had brought him to me, but rather an inner urge to work on his psyche. A strong mother tie, however, and a fear of committing himself to life were hidden behind this urge, but these were only discovered during the analytical work with me. He had just completed his studies and taken a position in a large factory, and he was facing the many problems of a young man on the threshold of manhood. "It appears to me," he wrote in a letter asking for an interview, "that this phase of my life is particularly important and meaningful. I must decide either to remain unconscious in a well-protected security, or else to venture on a yet unknown way of which I have great hopes. The choice thus confronting him was whether to remain a lonely, vacillating, and unrealistic youth, or to become a self-sufficient and responsible adult. Henry told me he preferred books to society. He felt inhibited among people, and was often tormented by doubts and self-criticism. He was well-read for his age, and had a leaning toward aesthetic intellectualism. After an earlier atheistic stage, he became rigorously Protestant, but finally his religious attitude became completely neutral. He had chosen a technical education because he felt his talents lay in mathematics and geometry. He possessed a logical mind, trained in the natural sciences, but he also had a propensity toward the irrational and mystical that he did not want to admit even to himself. About 2 years before his analysis began, Henry had become engaged to a Catholic girl from the French part of Switzerland. He described her as charming, efficient, and full of initiative. Nevertheless, he was uncertain whether he should undertake the responsibility of marriage. Since he had so little acquaintance with girls, he thought it might be better to wait, or even to remain a bachelor dedicated to a scholarly life. His doubts were strong enough to prevent his reaching a decision. He needed a further step toward maturity before he could feel sure of himself. Although qualities of both his parents were combined in Henry, he was markedly mother-bound. In his consciousness, he was identified with his real or light mother, who represented high ideals and intellectual ambitions. But in his unconscious, he was deeply in the power of the dark aspects of his mother-bound condition. His unconscious still held his ego in a stranglehold. All his clear-cut thinking and his efforts to find a firm standpoint in the purely rational remained nothing more than an intellectual exercise. The need to escape from this mother prison was expressed in hostile reactions to his real mother and a rejection of the inner mother as a symbol of the feminine side of the unconscious. But an inner power sought to hold him back in the condition of childhood, resisting everything that attracted him to the outside world. Even the attractions of his fiancée were not enough to free him from his mother ties and thus help him find himself. He was not aware that his inner urge for growth, which he felt strongly, included the need to detach himself from his mother. My analytical work with Henry lasted 9 months. Altogether, there were 35 sessions in which he presented 50 dreams. So short an analysis is rare. It is only possible when energy-laden dreams like Henry's speed up the process of development. Of course, from the Jungian point of view, there is no rule for the length of time required for a successful analysis. All depends on the individual's readiness to realize inner facts and on the material presented by his unconscious. Like most introverts, Henry led a rather monotonous outer life. During the day, he was completely involved in his job. In the evenings, he sometimes went out with his fiancée or with friends with whom he liked to have literary discussions. Quite often, he sat in his lodgings, absorbed in a book or in his own thoughts. Though we regularly discussed the happenings of his daily life, and also his childhood and youth, we usually got fairly quickly to the investigation of his dreams and the problems his inner life presented to him. It was extraordinary to see how strongly his dreams emphasized his call to spiritual development. But I must make it clear that not everything described here was told to Henry. In analysis, one must always remain conscious of how explosive the dreamer's dream symbols may be for him. The analyst can hardly be too careful and reserved. If too bright a light is thrown on the dream language of symbols, the dreamer can be driven into anxiety and thus led into rationalization as a defense mechanism. Or he can no longer assimilate them and can fall into a severe psychic crisis. Also, the dreams reported and commented on here are by no means all the dreams that Henry had during his analysis. I can discuss only an important few that influenced his development. In the beginning of our work, childhood memories with important symbolic meanings came up. The oldest dated back to Henry's 4th year. He said, "One morning I was allowed to go with my mother to the baker's shop, and there I received a crescent roll from the baker's wife. I did not eat the roll, but carried it proudly in my hand. Only my mother and the baker's wife were present, so I was the only man." Such crescents are popularly called moon teeth, and this symbolic allusion to the moon underlines the dominating power of the feminine, a power to which the little boy may have felt exposed, and which, as the only man, he was proud of being able to confront. Another childhood memory came from his 5th year. It concerned Henry's sister, who came home after her examinations at school and found him constructing a toy barn. The barn was made with blocks of wood, arranged in the form of a square and surrounded with a kind of hedge that looked like the battlements of a castle. Henry was pleased with his achievement and said teasingly to his sister, "You have started school, but you're already on holiday." Her reply, that he was on holiday all year, upset him terribly. He felt deeply hurt that his achievement was not taken seriously. Even years later, Henry had not forgotten the bitter hurt and injustice that he had felt when his construction was rejected. His later problems concerning the assertion of his masculinity and the conflict between rational and fantasy values are already visible in this early experience, and these problems are also to be seen in the images of his first dream. The initial dream. The day after Henry's first visit to me, he had the following dream. I was on an excursion with a group of people I did not know. We were going to the Zinner Rothorn. We had started from Zemaden. We only walked about an hour because we were to camp and have some theatricals. I was not given an active part. I especially remember one performer, a young woman in a pathetic role wearing a long flowing robe. It was midday, and I wanted to go on to the pass. As all the others preferred to remain, I went up alone, leaving my equipment behind. However, I found myself right back in the valley and completely lost my orientation. I wanted to return to my party, but did not know which mountainside I should climb. I was hesitant about asking. Finally, an old woman showed me the way I must go. Then I ascended from a different starting point than our group had used in the morning. It was a matter of making a turn at the right altitude and then following the mountain slope to return to the party. I climbed along a cogwheel mountain railway on the right side. On my left, little cars constantly passed me, each containing one hidden, bloated little man in a blue suit. It is said they are dead. I was afraid of other cars coming from behind and kept turning around to look so as not to be run over. My anxiety was needless. At the point where I had to turn off to the right, there were people awaiting me. They took me to an inn. A cloudburst came up. I regretted that my equipment, my rucksack and my motorbike were not there, but I was told not to get them till next morning. I accepted the advice. Dr. Jung assigned great importance to the first dream in an analysis, for according to him it often has anticipatory value. A decision to go into analysis is usually accompanied by an emotional upheaval that disturbs the deep psychic levels from which archetypal symbols arise. The first dreams, therefore, often present collective images that provide a perspective for the analysis as a whole and can give the therapist insight into the dreamer's psychic conflicts. What does the above dream tell us of Henry's future development? We must first examine some of the associations that Henry himself supplied. The village of Zemaden had been the home of Jörg Jenotch, a famous 17th century Swiss freedom fighter. The theatricals called up the thought of Goethe's Wilhelm Meister's Lehrjahre, which Henry liked very much. In the woman he saw a resemblance to the figure in a painting called The Island of the Dead by the 19th century Swiss artist Arnold Böcklin. The wise old woman, as he called her, seemed to be associated on the one hand to his analyst, on the other to the charwoman in J.B. Priestley's play They Came to a City. The cogwheel railway reminded him of the barn with battlements that he had built as a child. The dream describes an excursion, a sort of walking tour, which is a striking parallel to Henry's decision to undertake analysis. The individuation process is often symbolized by a voyage of discovery to unknown lands. Such a voyage takes place in John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress or in Dante's Divina Commedia. The traveler, in Dante's poem, searching for a way, comes to a mountain that he decides to climb. But because of three strange animals, a motif that will also appear in one of Henry's later dreams, he is forced to descend into the valley and even into hell. Later he ascends again to purgatory and finally reaches paradise. From this parallel, one could deduce that there might be a similar period of disorientation and lonely seeking in store for Henry. The first part of this life journey, represented as climbing a mountain, offers ascent from the unconscious to an elevated point of view of the ego, that is, to an increased consciousness. Zemaden is named as the starting point of the excursion. This is where Jenach, whom we may take as embodying the freedom-seeking sense within Henry's unconscious, started his campaign for the liberation of the Veltlin region of Switzerland from the French. Jenach had other characteristics in common with Henry. He was a Protestant who fell in love with a Catholic girl, and, like Henry, whose analysis was to free him from his mother ties and from fear of life, Jenach also fought for liberation. One could interpret this as a favorable augury for the success of Henry's own fight for freedom. The goal of the excursion is the Zinal-Rothorn, a mountain in western Switzerland that he did not know. The word rot, red, in Zinal-Rothorn touches on Henry's emotional problem. Red is usually symbolic of feeling or passion. Here it points to the value of the feeling function, which was insufficiently developed in Henry. And the word horn reminds one of the crescent roll in the baker's shop of Henry's childhood. After a short walk, a halt is called, and Henry can return to a state of passivity. This also belongs to his nature. The point is underlined by the theatricals. Attending the theater, which is an imitation of real life, is a popular way of evading an active part in life's drama. The spectator can identify with the play, yet continue to pander to his fantasies. This kind of identification permitted the Greeks to experience catharsis, much as the psychodrama initiated by the American psychiatrist J.L. Marino is now used as a therapeutic aid. Some such process may have enabled Henry to undergo an inner development when his associations raised memories of Wilhelm Meister, Goethe's story of the maturing of a young man. That Henry should have been impressed by the romantic appearance of a woman is also not surprising. This figure resembles Henry's mother, and is at the same time a personification of his own unconscious feminine side. The connection Henry makes between her and Böcklin's Island of the Dead points to his depressive mood, so well expressed by the painting, which shows a white-robed priest-like figure steering a boat bearing a coffin toward an island. We have here a significant double paradox. The keel of the boat seems to suggest a contrary course, away from the island, and the priest is a figure of uncertain sex. In Henry's associations, this figure is certainly hermaphroditic. The double paradox coincides with Henry's ambivalence. The opposites in his soul are still too undifferentiated to be clearly separated. After this interlude in the dream, Henry suddenly becomes aware that it is noon, and he must go on. So he again starts for the pass. A mountain pass is a well-known symbol for a situation of transition that leads from an old attitude of mind to a new one. Henry must go alone. It is essential for his ego to surmount the test unaided. Thus he leaves his kit behind, an action that signifies that his mental equipment has become a burden, or that he must change his normal way of going about things. But he does not reach the pass. He loses his bearings and finds himself back in the valley. This failure shows that while Henry's ego decides on activity, his other psychic entities, represented by the other members of the party, remain in the old state of passivity and refuse to accompany the ego. When the dreamer himself appears in a dream, he usually represents only his conscious ego. The other figures stand for his more or less unknown unconscious qualities. Henry is in a situation where he is helpless, yet ashamed to admit it. At this moment, he meets an old woman who indicates the right way to him. He can do nothing but accept her advice. The helpful old woman is a well-known symbol in myths and fairy tales for the wisdom of the eternal female nature. The rationalist Henry hesitates to accept her help because such acceptance requires a sacrificium intellectus, a sacrifice or discarding of a rational way of thought. This demand will often be made of Henry in later dreams. Such a sacrifice is unavoidable. It applies to his relationship with the analysis as well as with everyday life. He associated the figure of the old woman to the charwoman in Priestley's play about a new dream city, perhaps an analogy to the New Jerusalem of the Apocalypse, into which the characters can enter only after a kind of initiation. This association seems to show that Henry had intuitively recognized this confrontation as something decisive for him. The charwoman in Priestley's play says that in the city they have promised me a room of my own. There she will be self-reliant and independent, as Henry seeks to be. If such a technically minded young man as Henry is consciously to choose the way of psychic development, he must be prepared for a reversal of his old attitudes. Therefore, on the advice of the woman, he must start his climb from a different spot. Only then will it be possible for him to judge at what level he must deviate to reach the group, the other qualities of his psyche, that he had left behind. He climbs a cogwheel railway track, a motif perhaps reflecting his technical education, and keeps to the right side of the track, which is the conscious side. In the history of symbolism, the right side generally represents the realm of consciousness, the left, the unconscious. From the left, little cars are coming down, and in each a little man is hidden. Henry is afraid that an unnoticed upward-bound car might hit him from the rear. His anxiety proves groundless, but it reveals that Henry is afraid of what, so to speak, lies behind his ego. The bloated, blue-clothed men might symbolize sterile intellectual thoughts that are being brought down mechanically. Blue often denotes the function of thinking. Thus, the men might be symbols of ideas or attitudes that have died on the intellectual heights where the air is too thin. They could also represent lifeless inner parts of Henry's psyche. A comment on these men is made in the dream. It is said they are dead. But Henry is alone. Who makes this statement? It is a voice, and when a voice is heard in a dream, it is a most meaningful occurrence. Dr. Jung identified the appearance of a voice in dreams with an intervention of the self. It stands for a knowledge that has its roots in the collective fundaments of the psyche. What the voice says cannot be disputed. The insight Henry has gained about the dead formulas to which he has been too committed marks a turning point in the dream. He has at last reached the right place for taking a new direction, to the right, the conscious direction, toward the conscious and the outer world. There he finds the people he left behind waiting for him, and thus he can become conscious of previously unknown aspects of his personality. Since his ego has surmounted the dangers it confronted alone, an accomplishment that could make him more mature and stable, he can rejoin the group or collective and get shelter and food. Then comes the rain, a cloudburst that relaxes tension and makes the earth fertile. In mythology, rain was often thought to be a love union between heaven and earth. In the Eleusinian mysteries, for instance, after everything had been purified by water, the call went up to heaven, "Let it rain," and down to earth, "Be fruitful." This was understood as a sacred marriage of the gods. In this way, rain can be said to represent a solution in the literal sense of the word. Coming down, Henry again meets the collective values symbolized by the rucksack and motorcycle. He has passed through a phase in which he has strengthened his ego consciousness by proving he can hold his own, and he has a renewed need for social contact. However, he accepts the suggestion of his friends that he should wait and